This has been a notable month at this church. For 2 consecutive Sundays, the person slated to speak to you has found himself revising, redacting, and rewriting at the 11th hour the week's sermon due to events in the news that demand to be addressed. Last week, of course, Reverend White spoke of the murders of 9 church members holding a Bible study in Charleston. Hauntingly, his sermon had already been planned around the concepts of revenge and forgiveness. The young murderer had assumed revenge would be the response to his actions, but the congregation showed an astonishing capacity to forgive instead. I had happier news. On Friday of this week, the Supreme Court handed down a decision upholding marriage equality, something many members of this church have long been hoping for, even before it seemed a possibility. Unitarian Universalist ministers and congregations have held commitment ceremonies for same-sex couples for decades, highlighting our belief in the inherent worth and dignity of every person and in justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. Now, weddings held in this sanctuary will be attended not only by the couple's friends, family, and expression of the divine, but recognized by our nation as well. You can amen, that's good. And that is now true for all members of our congregation, regardless of gender, no matter who they love and choose to spend their lives with. I had been thinking the word of the day for worship this morning was going to be the Jungian term, synchronicity, the coincidence of events that seem related, but not obviously caused one by the other. I am one of the members of this church who had to decide whether to travel to another state to legally marry or to have a commitment ceremony with no legal bearing here in our church home, nearer friends and family, or to incur the expense of doing both. Then this past Friday happened, and I was scheduled to preach. In 2007, I read a review in Entertainment Weekly of UU minister and chaplain Kate Braystrip's memoir, Here If You Need Me. I bought the book, read it, and began recommending it to friends. 5 years later, I found myself applying to seminary, and on application essays, I would write, "Well, I know this is the road I'm meant to be traveling. I'm not sure where that road may lead, but chaplaincy seems a very real possibility." Of course, in hindsight, it's very clear where that idea came from. So I considered it a bit of synchronicity that when invited to speak today, the summer series revolved around the public radio conversation and podcast on being, and the episode I was slated to reflect upon was the one where Krista Tippett interviews Kate Braystrip. In the podcast, Tippett describes Braystrip as a chaplain to game wardens in the parks and forests of Maine. These are law enforcement officials in the wild, called in to respond to danger and disaster. And her work with them takes her, as she describes it, to hinges of human experience, moments where some lives are altered or ended and others swung in wholly unpredicted directions. Kate Braystrip calls this her ministry of presence to life and death, lost and found. And her life had its own unpredictable hinge in the sudden death of her state trooper husband at the age of 39. She learned then, she says, about the finality of loss and the human capacity, nevertheless, to cope and to care. To further add to this chain of coincidence, I'm currently doing my chaplaincy internship at a hospital here in Dallas. Although not even midway through my internship, I too have been taken to hinges of human experience, moments where some lives are altered or ended and others swung in wholly unpredicted directions. But the setting for my stories is well-lighted and well-scrubbed ICU rooms, not the moonlit or sunlight-dappled wilderness. Of course, Braystrip wasn't the first to realize or tell stories about the forest being a literal as well as a metaphorical, liminal place of threatening danger or one of refuge, a chance at adventure or transformation. The Christian Gospels tell of Jesus going into the wilderness to fast for 40 days and 40 nights and be tempted by Satan. We read that there he found wild beasts and angels waited on him. European settlers and pioneers traveled west across North America to a new life through the wilderness, some explored by the indigenous people, some not. In folklore, characters inevitably find themselves in the forest. And in Grimm's fairy tales, the hero always ventures into the forest, which is revealed as a place of transformation. Dorothy found that the yellow brick road led through a forest of decidedly anthropomorphic trees and animals. Tolkien wrote of the Old Forest, Mirkwood, and Fangorn Forest. And Harry Potter knows of the Forbidden Forest near Hogwarts. The list goes on and on and on. Braystrup tells of the connection she makes with others in the wilderness. That is what chaplains do. We make connections. And I suspect that is why many of you are here today too. Human beings want to make connections and live in community. She tells of witnessing in her presence of ministry life-altering events that sometimes end sadly, sometimes end happily, but are always, to some degree, transformative. Her stories typically tell of people who are lost in the woods, either by intention or happenstance. The game wardens she talks to usually comment on the foolishness of those wandering away alone or skating on a pond whose ice is not quite yet frozen over. But several times in the book, as she stands in the awe-inducing moonlit forest or gazes at the shimmering ice crystals on the surface of a lake, Braystrup expresses an understanding of why someone would make that seemingly foolish choice to come alone to witness this sacred place of potential spiritual renewal. It occurred to me, it is never reported to the game wardens when those who come to the wilderness are spiritually transformed and renewed and return home safely. They only hear about the foolishness. I realized about this time that perhaps the word of the day was not synchronicity, but instead was paradox, a self-contradictory statement. In this morning's reading, Braystrup's friend Hannah told her the time she spent walking through the blizzard on the lake, miles from nowhere, was the most joyous time of her whole life. Yet she was pleased when it ended. There it is, Braystrup said, another spiritual paradox. Many might ask, well, was it the most joyous time of your life, or were you happy when it ended? Yes. UUs are also typically more likely to demand both possibilities than be coerced into choosing one option from a list of two. Is it A or B? Yes. Unitarians and Universalists and many others have gone back and forth for centuries whether the head or the heart might be better at resolving our personal, religious, and social issues. Which is it? So when asked, which is a better incubator for nurturing one's spirituality and capacity for love, solitude or community, many of us might answer, yes. Psychologist and proponent of Buddhist meditation, Tara Brach said, the spiritual path is not a solo endeavor. In fact, the very notion of a self who is trying to free her or himself is a delusion. We are in it together, and the company of spiritual friends help us realize our interconnectedness. However, UU provider of wisdom and quotes, Henry David Thoreau, wrote in Walden, I love to be alone. I never found a companion that was so companionable as solitude. We are, for the most part, more lonely when we go abroad among men than when we stay in our chambers. So which is it? Solitude or community? A quiet walk alone in the wilderness, or the warmth of friendship in church or neighborhood? Recently, while learning about church history, I was given an insight. Yes, community is vital for support and spiritual reflection. But as is so often the case, sweeping statements are problematic. Down through history, the church was consistently finding that those secreted away in convents and monasteries and out in the desert, a different kind of wilderness, were making the most profound realizations about the most kind and loving ways to live, and doing it on their own. It seems that contemplatives in solitude, in my opinion, have done some of the best work relating to and reflecting upon the divine. Trappist monk Thomas Merton, another favorite of mine, was not only a mystic and poet, he managed to be a social activist from the woods in an abbey in Kentucky. Hardly hate Ashbury. The paradox is that both solitude and community are the better way to grow spiritually. My first semester in seminary, I had a realization. Well, I had several, but this one I'm going to tell you about. Discussions in class would inevitably remind the other students of particular Bible verses, which they would quote and reference. I, however, was typically reminded of lyrics from Broadway shows. I knew, however, that this would not be an insurmountable problem as I plan to preach in UU churches. Earlier, I talked about characters from fairy tales and folklore that venture into the wilderness and find adventure and transformation. In Stephen Sondheim's musical Into the Woods, familiar and new characters enter alone into the forest. Throughout the show, they realize the advantages of depending on one another, even as those moments in the woods transform their lives. Near the end of the first act, after struggling to complete a difficult task whose success will change his life, the baker realizes the outcome is just as important to his wife, and he admits it takes two to complete the task, make his way through the woods and through life. He sings, "It takes two. I thought one was enough. It's not true. It takes two of us. You came through when the journey was rough. It took you. It took two of us." Or, in the words of Justice Kennedy, in forming a marital union, two people become something greater than once they were. Marriage embodies a love that may endure even past death. Their hope is not to be condemned to live in loneliness. Near the end of the second act of the musical, many of the characters, alone again, but in different and in heartbreaking ways, sing the song "No One Is Alone." On the surface, this may seem a simple and haunting ballad of reassurance, but it's more. The characters have traveled into the wild, lost loved ones, and feel very alone. But they sing both to each other and to convince themselves that even through painful loneliness, no one has to go it alone. They sing, "Sometimes people leave you halfway through the wood. Others may deceive you. You decide what's good. You decide alone, but no one is alone." The characters draw strength from one another. When I enter a hospital room, at some point I will steer the conversation to ask where the patient draws strength. Often there's family in the room, family who is supporting the patient, but of course need support themselves. And I'll ask if they have friends at church praying for them. Almost everyone tells me they feel blessed to have so many people caring and praying for them. And now I pray that everyone in the hospital, whether patient or concerned loved one, finds they can introduce their spouse to the chaplains, nurses, and doctors without awkward pauses or euphemisms. But I know it's just a matter of time before I enter the room of someone with no family, no faith community, and seemingly no support. But very kind, listening, and knowledgeable nurses are there, and I assure them I am there to talk with them, listen to them, and pray for them. It is a ministry of presence. Kate Braystrup ends her book with a story of an elderly woman, an Alzheimer's patient who had wandered off into the woods. By the time Braystrup arrived at the firehouse command post, a set of wardens with their dogs, maps, laptops, and GPS units had assembled. But additionally, a small army of volunteers had shown up, ready to help. Local firefighters, off-duty sheriff's deputies, and town cops, the local rod and gun club, the volunteer Maine search and rescue dog team, elderly backwoods guys, the local equestrian club with their horses, the high school varsity soccer team, and a group of Marines. The terrain was rough and the weather grew ugly, but still they searched. Everyone wanted to find the elderly woman, even those who had never met her. The chaplain tells of the searchers returning for lunch. Still more volunteers had prepared mountains of food. The firehouse is filled with people, she writes, joined in community, bent on the common purpose of love. The son of the elderly and lost woman looks around. This is incredible, he says. Everyone in the world is here. No one is alone, even when we fear we might be. We hold thoughts and memories of those we love who aren't here in person. Many of us believe we are held in the arms of a loving God, even when we are physically alone. We have spouses, legal and about to be legal, family, friends, and even strangers who are inextricably linked. Certainly, and I want to emphasize this, as a member of this faith community, you are not alone. Perhaps the real paradox is not the concept that both solitude and community is the better incubator for nurturing one's spirituality and capacity for love. Perhaps the real paradox is that even when we are alone, we are not alone. We are all invited to participate in this ministry of presence. Amen.